The last two videos in this series showed how I took 147.8 pounds out of my 1993 2.3-liter Mustang Autocross car. I've taken on the tough task of trying to trim 500 pounds out of Apocalypso. And because I've only taken 0.56 pounds out of Zone 1, it's time to focus on getting some fat off the front of the car. This video covers weight from under the hood that's free or inexpensive to remove. I'm going to delete the AC, eliminate some unnecessary items, and swap in a Ranger header in place of the OEM exhaust manifold. All the parts were weighed on a digital bathroom scale or a digital kitchen scale. Let's start with the AC. The air conditioning in this car was working, so before I disconnected the lines, I had the system drained at a shop for $60. You will need special tools to disconnect the lines. They're available at most auto parts stores. And you'll have to take the front bumper cover off to remove the condenser. The condenser weighs 5 pounds. The condenser brackets weigh 1.03 pounds. The lower condenser hose and clips weigh 0.625 pounds. The hose fittings can be difficult to disconnect even with the tool. I used PB Blaster, Windex, and tried rotating the condenser fittings, but it still took 2 hours of fiddling with the fittings to separate them. You probably won't have as much trouble with the fittings as I did, but it is possible. You'll want to cap off the evaporator core tubes that stick through the firewall. The AC belt weighs 0.164 pounds. The AC compressor and hardware weigh 15.3 pounds. The dryer, hose, and bracket weigh 5 pounds. The AC compressor bracket, hardware, and tensioner pulley weigh 5.8 pounds. There's a wiring bracket bolted to the AC compressor bracket. With the AC bracket removed, you need a 1-inch thick spacer to keep the wiring bracket away from the engine. Removing the air conditioning took 32.92 pounds out from under the hood. The AC delete took me 4 hours. If the fittings separate easily, this job should only take about 2.5 hours. Apocalypso's airbag isn't working, so I'm removing the 3 airbag sensors mounted on the core support. Always disconnect the battery and wait a few minutes prior to working on the airbag system to avoid setting off the airbag. Together, the sensors, brackets, and bolts weigh 3.03 pounds. It took 1 hour to remove the sensors and brackets because you have to remove the airbox and the battery tray to get access to the airbag sensor wires. I put some dielectric grease on the connectors, covered them with balloons, and zip-tied them to adjacent wires. The hood light and wire weigh 0.11 pounds. They came off in 5 minutes. There are 2 brackets on the core support. Together, they weigh 0.79 pounds and can be removed in 5 minutes. For some strange reason, Ford decided to put a heavy cast exhaust manifold on 2.3-liter Mustangs. A common weight reduction mod for 4-cylinder Mustangs is to swap in a Ranger header. When I researched this swap, I found a lot of different information. I always try to be as accurate as possible, but some aspects of the Ranger header swap are a little nebulous. Most of the information I found online was 10 to 15 years old. As far as I can tell, the Ranger came with a fuel-injected 2.3-liter from 1985 to 1997. But posts on several forums reference changes to the headers over the years, such as the position of the O2 sensor bung and the height of the EGR tube. My research made one thing very clear. Just because you found a 2.3-liter Ranger in a salvage yard doesn't mean the header and EGR tube will fit perfectly on your Mustang. Having reference photos of your Mustang on hand will help when you're searching for the correct parts. Some 2.3-liter Mustangs and Rangers had different emissions equipment from the factory. Vehicles built with air injection reaction emissions equipment have a line that sends air into the exhaust manifold, usually between the number 3 and number 4 cylinders, that distributes air into the head. It's a good idea to know what emissions equipment you have before deciding to attempt the Ranger header swap. My 1993 Mustang doesn't have the air injection reaction emissions equipment. I was concerned about the small changes in design over the years, so I wanted to get a header off of a 1993 Ranger. But I couldn't find one at my local salvage yards. I got my header off of a 1994 Ranger that also didn't have air injection reaction emissions equipment. The following advice is based on my experience swapping that 1994 Ranger header into my 1993 Mustang. Your experience might vary depending on the year of your Mustang and Ranger header. When you go to the salvage yard, make sure you get the Ranger EGR tube, because the fitting on the Ranger header is a different size than the fitting on the Mustang manifold. My 1993 Mustang EGR tube wouldn't fit the 1994 Ranger header. Be prepared to get the header, EGR tube, and EGR valve without separating them. The EGR tube fittings on the Ranger and my Mustang were incredibly difficult to loosen. I tried PB Blaster first, but ultimately I needed to use a torch and pound on the wrench with a rubber mallet. Penetrating oil is flammable, so don't use PB Blaster and a torch at the same time. Each fitting took roughly 30 minutes to separate. Many salvage yards won't allow you to use torches, so make sure you have the tools to remove the EGR valve from the intake manifold if you can't separate the EGR tube from the EGR valve. It can be a tight space to work in. I used a 10mm ratchet wrench. It's also important to get the Ranger header hardware. The bolts that go into the head are a little longer than the Mustang manifold bolts. The Mustang manifold and EGR tube weigh 22.9 pounds. The Ranger header and EGR tube weigh 9 pounds. That's a weight savings of 13.9 pounds. You will need a new header gasket and a new EGR gasket. I needed new bolts and lock washers to connect the header to the midpipe. The OEM bolts I got from the salvage yard were too rusty to use. I chose to install a new Bosch oxygen sensor. Both the Ranger and Mustang OEM hoses that go from the heat shield to the airbox weren't long enough. I sourced a 2-inch inner diameter 2-ply high-temp silicone air duct hose from Pegasus Auto Racing Supplies. My Ranger EGR tube had provisions for hoses that I didn't need, so I had them removed. And I replaced the frayed OEM heat wrap with 1¼ inch diameter DEI heat sleeve. I cleaned up the OEM Ranger header bolts with a wire wheel, and I put anti-seize on the threads and the shanks to make sure they don't rust in place. There's an OEM coil pack heat shield mounted on the number 1 exhaust tube, but mine had rusted and broken off. I'll make a new heat shield soon. Including the 2 hours I spent fighting the fittings, the Ranger header swap took me 6 hours. But if all goes smoothly, this job should only take 4.5 hours. The Ranger header cost $33. The oxygen sensor cost $23. The gaskets cost $14. The hardware cost $7. The silicone hose cost $60 with shipping, and the DEI heat sleeve cost $20, bringing the total cost of the Ranger header swap to $157. In all transparency, I intend to install a performance header when I upgrade the engine, but I wanted to show people how much weight they can save with the Ranger header swap. I spent $217 on the weight reduction mods in this video, and because I had to wrestle with a few fittings, the work took 11 hours and 10 minutes to complete. Removing the AC, airbag sensors, hood light, and core support brackets, and swapping in the Ranger header took 50.75 pounds out from under the hood. That brings my total weight out of Zone 1 to 51.31 pounds. So far, I've taken 198.6 pounds out of Apocalypso. I'm creeping closer to my lofty goal of getting 500 pounds out of this pony. The next video in this series will cover more inexpensive weight reduction mods.